Hello folks, thought I would do something a bit different than normal for my video channel. A book review. I used to have to do them in university, but it's been a while, and this won't be anything like the formal text required of a school book review. If this turns out well, there will be more. I'm going to try and not spoil much of this story if I can, so if you despise spoilers, you might want to turn away now. Before I dig into Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, book one in his Space Trilogy, who was C.S. Lewis? I'm going to try and condense Lewis into 3 paragraphs, a very difficult task for a life so large. Clive Staples Lewis was an Oxford scholar, where he had also studied and been an honours student. Later in his career, he accepted the position of the newly created Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature at Cambridge, where he completed his career, though Oxford always remained home in his heart. Various circumstances had convinced him during his youth to become an atheist. However, he returned to Christianity in 1931 via theism in 1929, giving, as one of his reasons for accepting Christ, discussions and debate with his close friend J.R.R. Tolkien, himself a strong Christian and Catholic. Lewis chose to attend the Anglican Church, which he preferred strictly for the sacraments and to be with other common believers. Together, Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and a few other friends had formed an informal literary group known as the Inklings, who would meet in the early days at the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford to read and critique each other's works. On to Out of the Silent Planet. Lewis is famous for many works, both fiction and non-fiction. Among these is the allegorical Narnia series, where we see the lion Aslan as a representation of the Christ. However, that's for another review. The Space Trilogy is not allegory in any way, as Lewis himself states in the introduction to each book, where he refers to the characters as strictly fictitious and not in any way allegorical. The books do, however, have a strong moral message based upon many of Lewis's own beliefs and experiences, which I will get into as we go along. Our protagonist, Dr. Elwyn Ransom, who, to my mind, resembles a cross between Lewis himself and his friend Tolkien, is a philologist who loves to take long walking holidays in the countryside, which was also a love of Lewis and his brother Warnie, and he reminds me of Tolkien because of the love for languages. He is kidnapped by 2 scientists, Weston and Devine, who have questionable motives. They take him to the planet Malacandra. I will leave it up to you, the reader, to learn of that world's location by reading the story. Ransom is to be given to an indigenous people to sacrifice. But is that the species' true motive, or have Weston and Devine misinterpreted what these peoples wished to know or to do? However, before we can find out, Ransom escapes and thus begins his real adventure. The 3 indigenous peoples of Malacandra are the Seroni, the Hrossa, and the Fifiltrigi. There's a mouthful. In addition, there is a 4th species, the Eldila. I will leave you to read and discover these last creatures for yourself. Are they angels or something else? We never really see them, but we know they are there and they do speak. This book tells us much about Lewis and his own beliefs in the way he tells us this tale, which is a variation on an old and true theme: greed and conquest. Ransom and his new friend, Oyarsa, who is an Eldila, show their disgust at Weston and Devine for their actions, their greed, and their lack of empathy for others. Oyarsa refers to them as bent. Ransom, though he refers to himself as also being bent, proves himself to be the better man than either of his two kidnappers, earning the respect of the peoples of Malacandra, and especially of the Eldila. How did Lewis come to write a book so different from what he normally wrote? It came about as a challenge between himself and Tolkien. Tolkien was to write a time travel story, which was never completed, while Lewis was to write a space travel story, which became the Space Trilogy. Now, what do I think about this book? It is, as is typical for Lewis, well written and very well thought out. As is typical also of an author from the early 20th century, the language is also typical of an early 20th century Oxford scholar. A little above the head of the average reader at times, and so also a little quaint in places. The reader may wish to keep a dictionary handy in order to understand the meanings of some of the more technical words, and also some of the more quaint ones. There were two words in particular which knocked me out of the story, and I needed to look up before going on. These words are today rarely used. One was somnambulist. Wait, what? Yes, somnambulist. More readily understood today would be the word sleepwalker. According to my old friend the 1913 Webster, a somnambulist is a person who is subject to somnambulism, one who walks in his sleep. A sleepwalker, a noctambulist. The synonym is somnambulator. The second word which knocked me out of the story in the first book was preternaturalist. Again, huh? Let's turn to the dictionary. Meaning 1, existing outside of nature. Meaning 2, exceeding what is natural or regular, extraordinary. Example phrase is, the stars were preternaturally bright. In other words, the stars were brighter than they normally would be, in an otherworldly fashion. Be prepared for verbiage such as this. This didn't ruin the story for me. Your mileage may vary. An interesting literary tool or technique Lewis uses here was placing himself in the story. He was both narrator and character, where he indicates the story as being almost biographical in nature and yet also fictitious in nature. He did something similar in the Screwtape Letters, though in the Screwtape Letters he basically gave an introduction, whereas in Out of the Silent Planet he places himself into the last couple of chapters. It could be argued that the character he introduces, oddly, this character's name is Lewis, is simply a fictional narrator we get to see after the fact, simply another character in the book. If you enjoy Tolkien or H.G. Wells, who he also mentions in the beginning of this book, by the way, you will probably enjoy this story. Give it a try. Ciao, Mata.